Difficult life transitions, and here's the thing, not all life transitions are difficult, right? We have good ones too, like babies being born and marriage. So we're talking about the hard ones because nobody wants anything to do with those, right? So managing difficult life transitions. So I'm going to start out with a statement. We all suffer. It's part of the human condition. If you're human, you're going to suffer. And I'm sure many of you already have. You've been through life transitions. And some of you, the younger ones, may not have been through much yet, but they will come. And it's not to scare you, but it's just to tell you that it's part of the human condition. And they serve as an equalizer because they do not discriminate. So let me go to the next slide. Oops. So Sean, let's see. Do I go right here?
Should. All right. Pause, technical difficulties. Not her laptop.
Well, I can still talk while he's doing that. So basically, I like to call my life transition, which showed up in the form of an unwanted divorce, my holy kick in the pants. And that's what it was. And I'll get to that more later in the presentation. But first, I really want to talk about what a life transition is. So like I said, common denominator, it's an equalizer, it's oftentimes an unthinkable event, right? So here, let's go to what a transition is. Actually, what's that? Oh, I need to stand here, don't I?
Yeah.
I'm walking all over the place. Okay. So here's an analogy that I would like to present to you. So I'm a child of the 80s. I was born in 71, and we did not have digital photography, right? So we had to go in the darkroom, and I was a photography minor in college. So we would go into the darkroom, and we had no idea what the process of what the film was going to look like when it was projected on the paper, right? So the thing is, that's how I want you to view a life transition. There is a time of darkness, and you have no idea what's going to come out of this life transition. But the dark room, or the time of darkness, is the process that must take effect. So with that idea, with that analogy, know that in life transitions, even though we want nothing to do with it, it's very necessary for us to be in that period of darkness, and then there will be clarity. All right, so here's the thing. Many times in that darkness, we run away. We don't want anything to do with it. We resist, we dig our heels in, and we're like, I don't want this. God, why me, right? So the thing is, when we do this, we may miss the chance to grow and expand. And what happens is we retract and we shrink and we get stuck in the pain. So when we get stuck in the pain, we have the tendency to be a victim of our story. So we ask again, why me? You know, why? I think of Job, right? He's being tortured. You know, he's got boils all over him. And he's like, why am I suffering? And I did the same thing, not with the boils, but with my unwanted divorce. I was like, why are the wicked prospering and I am suffering, right? So you go to that place. You don't want anything to do with the life transition. So here's an idea that I would like to plant in your mind right now. There is an opportunity for massive personal growth and expansion in all adversity. And what if we took on a belief that this is when God does his best work? This is when God shapes you. It's just that period of darkness that we have to get through. So, what will you do when an unthinkable life transition happens to you? And like I said, you've probably been through some. So let's define what a life transition is. A transition is an in-between period in the life development of a Christ follower. It's when God pushes the pause button, or in my case, it was more like a record scratch, a very loud one. And it stopped me in my tracks. And here's what a transition can do if you allow it to go through you. These are the positive things that can come out of a life transition. They can bring about needed change, because without transitions, we don't grow. They also can provide clarity in your life direction, and I'll show you how that's exactly what it did for me. Another thing is they can shift your paradigm, and paradigms are one of those words that a lot of people don't really know what it means, but it is a mental program that has almost exclusive control over our habitual behavior, and most of all of our behavior is habitual. So if you shift a paradigm, you're really shifting like your identity, right? And then they can deepen your convictions and values. So this is what a life transition, when you allow it to go through you and you get all you can out of it, this is what they can do for you. All right, so again, we want understanding. We don't like that period of darkness. We don't like the dark room, and we run. But what we have to do, and I tell a lot of my clients who are in the vice grips of pain, you must trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding, because we want to understand. We want to have some reasoning why this is happening, but sometimes we just can't do that. You cannot lean on your understanding. You have to trust the Lord. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. So now I would like to tell you how my story and what happened with my holy kick in the pants. So this is me in 2006 with my family, with my first husband. And we had just moved to California. Let me give you a backstory. So I'm from Macon, Georgia, and I met this guy in 5th grade. And I went to a prep school, a very conservative prep school, and he was a new kid in town, and he walks in with red parachute pants on. And I thought he was weird. And he said he noticed me. Well, of course, we were boys and girls back then in 5th grade. They're not going to really talk, but we did have this magnetism. And we later learned that our parents knew each other when both of our mothers were pregnant with us. So when my mother was pregnant with me, his mother was pregnant with him, and they knew each other. So naturally we said we were womb mates, right? So we had a connection way before we even met. So we met in 5th grade, we were interested in each other, but didn't do anything. And then in middle school, we became friends. And he gave me gum, right? And then in high school, we actually became super close. He was hysterical, still is, a very funny man. And so we became tight. Well, he always said that he was trying to get out of the friend zone, but I didn't want anything to do with him because he was much too wild for me. He liked to smoke and drink and take drugs, and I already had that at home. I had a father who was a severe alcoholic. So I wanted nothing to do with that part of his life, so I kept him at a 6 foot with a 6 foot pole. But we were still good friends. So we went off to college, we went our separate ways, and we stayed in touch. And then I went to Italy, ate my way through Italy, did art, came back, and there he was. And this time he's changed. He doesn't smoke, he doesn't drink, or drinks very little. And I was like, maybe I should give him a chance. It's so easy. He fits like a glove. He already knows my story. I don't have to explain myself. I don't have to explain the spectacular dysfunction at home, right? So we get married. We date and get married in 2000. In 2002, we have our first child. In 2005, we have the second child. And it was interesting because in our marriage, I need to preface this, we did not have God. I was of faith. He believed in something larger than himself, but we did not share our faith. So what I would notice is that he would go through these dips of restlessness. And so we would have to quell that by getting a bigger, better deal, whatever that looked like. That could be a house. That could be a car. That could be a move. It could be a trip. It was extravagance. We just had to fill that hole. And it was always with a distraction of pleasure, right? So I noticed he was doing this, and in 2006, he announced to me, we're still living in Macon, Georgia. I have my mother down the street. The kids are in nursery and Montessori. Everything's set up. He announces to me, I've got to get out of this place or I'm going to go crazy. It's stagnant. I got to move. And I'm looking at him like, are you crazy? I got the whole setup. I got the great house. I got the Montessori school. My mom's down the street. Your mother's across the street, which isn't the greatest thing, but still, I got a good setup, right? And he's like, no, I got to go. And so I said, I knew that if I didn't move with him, that the marriage would be over. So I decided to quell that restlessness, and I said, okay, let's move. And we pretty much threw a dart. And this is how we got to La Jolla. He says to me, well, I hear Tony Robbins likes La Jolla, so I think we should move there. And I was like, all right. So we literally go laterally, like a lateral move from Macon, Georgia. I think it's right across Del Mar is the direct line. So we end up in La Jolla. I mean, what's not to like here? It's beautiful. So I was like, yeah, this is great. So we set up and we get a house. I renovate the house. He's doing really well in business. And I pick out every doorknob and window and light fixture. And it takes about 6 months, right? So we get it all fixed up. And honestly, the day that the last piece, the last item on the punch list is done, it is complete. He looks to me, he's like, this house, it just isn't, I don't know, it just doesn't say dun da da da. I was like, what? I mean, I just poured my heart and soul into this house, and you're telling me that this isn't good enough? And that restlessness came up again. So within a year, we moved to the bigger, better deal. And we got this amazing house, mansion overlooking the Pacific, and it looked from the outside like we had it all. But I just wanted to be back at the old house that I renovated. So, that helped for about 3 years. It quelled that anxiety, that restlessness, and so then, of course, naturally it came back up, right? So he, at this point, is traveling all over, and he's like the Anthony Robbins of internet marketing. So he has followers. He's on stage. He's very popular. I stay at home with the girls, and he travels. So he goes to Vegas on a trip, and I notice he leaves his wedding band in the shower. I was like, oh, that's really odd. So I pick up the phone, and I'm like, hey, is there a reason you left your wedding band? He's like, no, don't worry about that. That's just complete accident. And I said, gosh, that really doesn't make me feel very secure. And he's like, no, I promise. I go, well, can we work on our relationship when you come back? We were having a little lull, like any marriage, we're at 11 and a half years at this point. He goes, absolutely. And he was eager. So the next day, I'm super excited about picking him up from the airport. And I go to the airport, and he's on the curb, and he slings his bag in. He sits in the front seat, and he says, it's over. And I was like, wait, what are you talking about? Southwest Airlines? What are you talking about? He's like, our marriage. And I was like, whoa, what? It came out of left field. And it blindsided me, and I knew I had 15 minutes to state my case, because it was a 15-minute drive from the airport to our front door. Well, in my heart, I knew there was nothing I could say or do. He had made up his mind, and that was it. So what happened is it launched me into, I was completely devastated. And so I went into the first quadrant of this life transition wheel right here, entering the valley. But there was more to the story. So a couple of weeks later, I learned that he has a girlfriend. So that was pretty devastating, right? And then about 3 weeks later, I learned she is pregnant. And then I learned that they're going to get married soon, as soon as the divorce is final. I had the fastest divorce ever. From date of separation to the finalization was 6 months. 2 weeks later, he was married with a pregnant wife. 1 month later, they had a baby. This is in the span of 7 months. I was devastated. And in fact, I wrote a book, and I called it Apocalyptic Devastation. Every time, I felt like I'd been in a tsunami. And if you know anything about tsunamis, they come in waves of 3. Every time I came up for air, I got hit with some other information that was so mind-blowing that I was like, how can this happen? You know, I was like the person that said, why are the wicked prospering and I am hurting so much? I was like, I haven't done anything wrong. Why, God, are you punishing me? And I was so incredibly dazed and confused and restless and isolated. I felt completely alone, and I had absolutely no self-confidence. I had been steamrolled. So this is the first quadrant of any life transition, is the entry point. It's entering the valley. You will feel these things. Okay? So here's the thing about the entering the valley phase. Oftentimes you think you enter that phase when the crisis hits. So when he said it's over. But actually, I had entered that phase many years prior, and my body was alerting me. I used to get hives all over my body from head to toe. I couldn't even leave the house. Sometimes my lip would be so big, I looked like I had the aboriginal disc in it. I couldn't leave the house. My body knew better than my mind did. It was telling me something's wrong, but I wasn't listening. So here's the thing. We're going to go to our exercise. Does everyone have the sheet? I guess we didn't get the sheet of the exercise. Oh, here they are. So we need to hand them out. So while he's handing them out, I'm just going to go through this phase. So the first part of entering the valley, I want you to, actually, let me read what the evaluation period is. The evaluation period is when we recognize that the transition is not, back up. We're in the entry phase. Okay, every transition begins with an ending. We have to let go of the old thing before we can pick up the new, not just outwardly, but inwardly. In this entry phase, the disaster has hit and you are left dazed and confused. You know you are in a transition when you feel anxious, restless, uncertain, isolated, and alone. You are still reeling and you don't know which way is up. You're not able to make life work. And something's got to change. You're pleading with God. So this is when I want you to look at the worksheet, and I want you to retrieve a life transition from your memory. And if you don't have one, use a character of the Bible or someone you know. So then start answering the questions. List some of the keywords. These are mine. You can come up with your own. And I'll just briefly go through my answers while you fill it out. So what was happening between me and God? I was pleading with God, save this marriage. And he was saying, no, not going to do it. So how could you see God's hand in this entry phase? Well, later on, I saw it. In the beginning, I could not see it. Later on, I saw that God was removing me from a very bad situation that I would not remove myself from. And the last question, every transition begins with an ending. For me, the ending was my marriage, of course. So now you take the time, you do the exercise, and when you look up, I'll know you're ready to move on. Enter this first quadrant, and life seems incredibly difficult, and I'm in the fight, flight, or freeze mode of operation. I have a reptilian brain. I can't even make it to the post office. Every little task seems so daunting, right? So then once I start accepting that this divorce is going to happen. I mean, there's nothing I can do. It's going to happen. I started going down into the settling in phase. This is a period of evaluation. Now I want you to notice the watermark, because that marks the underwater. You feel underwater because you don't know which way is up. It's also this part right here, the surrendering and settling in, is the period of darkness, and it is the bulk of the transition. That is the hardest part, and it's where you're going to hang out the most. And so here, let me read you what the evaluation or the settling in period is. It's when we recognize that the transition is not going away. We settle into the space and grasp for understanding, oftentimes reflecting on our past to figure out how we arrived here in the valley. We want to understand the whys of our transition and our situation. It's an examination period to gain perspective on God's purpose. So here is when you go shoulda, coulda, woulda, right? So let me go to the next slide so you can see the key words. So you contemplate, you question, you evaluate, you start thinking to yourself, if I had done that, maybe he wouldn't have left me. If I had done this, your regret is very much a part of this phase. And so here's the thing though, you do a lot of rehashing too. It goes hand in hand. The settling in goes hand in hand with surrendering or alignment. And what happens is you swing back and forth because you're like, shoulda, coulda, woulda. You're like, oh, wait, I think this might be a good thing. And then you're like, nope, don't want anything to do with it. And then you're like, oh, wait, maybe this is God's will. But the more you stay here, you do have a tendency. There is a risk involved, but let me first tell you what mine looked like. So I'd been knocked sideways, but I had to start looking at myself in the mirror and like, who are you? There was many decisions in many parts of my life that were incongruent. I questioned, how did I get to this point? How did I arrive here in this valley, right? And I reevaluated what I stood for. And I started surrendering to God's will and becoming more pliable, because this is when God is shaping you. This is like the dark room when I said earlier, where God can do his best work. But we want to know why. We want to know what God knows. And sometimes we just have to stay in the dark. So I was aligning myself with God, with God's will, and then I would swing back and do that. Well, I don't know. And then let's go back to Job. When he was going through all of his pain, loss of, death and boils, he was angry, but he ran to God. He didn't run from God. So this is very important that you invite God into the transition, because if we don't, the risk is, if we don't invite him into our story, we become stuck. And then we become a victim of our story. And we start focusing on the pain. And whatever we focus on expands and expands, right? So it's many times people, when they don't invite God into the story, it's like they're looking at their life story projected. And they see the credits rolling, but their name is not there. And so they lose meaning. And so what do? They try to find meaning by distracting themselves with pleasure, which is what my husband did for most of our marriage, right? He didn't have meaning. Let's put more stuff in, more stuff. There's a hole, put it in, right? So that's what you risk if you do not invite God into your story. And like I said, you're like an acrobat. You just go back and forth. And you sometimes make headway, and then you're like, no, I'm not ready. And so eventually you start edging more into coming to terms with God's will and alignment. So here's what I realized when I started making my way and spending more time in the surrendering phase. I realized that I had been straddling two worlds, and I was living a life of incongruence. My first husband, I told you in the beginning, he had a history of drugs and alcohol. Well, that came back in our marriage. And so I had one foot in a world of debauchery. And then I had one foot in a world of a Bible study, a women's Bible study. And I was straddling these two worlds. And if you're living in that kind of incongruence, there is going to be a shakeup no matter what. And this was my shakeup. This was my holy kick in the pants. And so what I was saying, there was a massive gaping wound in our marriage. And it's where God should be. But instead, we were filling it with possessions and distractions and money and bigger, better deals to quell the feelings of unhappiness and restlessness and, just his anxiety, right? So once I started coming to terms with who I was, my paradigm was shifting, right? I no longer accepted or sugarcoated the dysfunction, and I had a lot of dysfunction in my house, in my married life, and in my childhood. But here's the thing. My father set the dysfunction bar about here, and my husband was about here. So he didn't seem so bad when I married him, but he got to right there, right where my father was. And so finally, I started seeing dysfunction for what it was, right? So I no longer sugarcoated it. And I had to leave behind something to pick up something new. So I had to leave behind my old self to create a new godly life. And that was hard, because you're changing your identity. So again, I swung from these points of surrendering, from settling into surrendering. So vacillating between the two. So like I said, I often refer to this as my holy kick in the pants because it was God shouting to me. And as C.S. Lewis says, God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf ear. And I had a megaphone. And I mean, it was so loud and clear that I needed to get out of this marriage. And I would have never done it. I know I wouldn't. And so God did it for me. So now let's stop there, go back to your sheet, and start answering the questions for these two phases that go together. This is the underwater mark. It's funny because I say underwater, and then I wrote a book, and the cover is Heels Underwater, because that's what I felt like when I was going through divorce. So this is it goes very well with a life transition. So go ahead and fill out the next exercise, and then we'll move to the gift after that. And again, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to just shout them out. Phase, I started realizing that I couldn't sugarcoat dysfunction anymore. I could no longer accept the unacceptable. My eyes started coming above water, right? And I started going into a direction phase, which is called the gift phase. And the direction phase is the aha moment, when you catch yourself saying, "For this I was born." You have set your sails toward a point of destination, and you may not know how you're going to get there. When you are aligned with God, destiny experiences will occur to advance your passion and purpose, making it possible for you to see God's plan unfold. So this started happening to me. When I started realizing that this was for the greater good and this pain did have purpose, I wrote a book, and I knew that it was something that I had to get out there. I fell into a coaching class because one of my friends said, "I think you should go to this coaching class at the church. You fit perfectly." And I was like, okay. I went, fell in love with coaching. Then I realized I have to get this book out. So these destiny experiences were just showing up. I got asked to speak at a women's retreat. I had never spoken before. I was like, okay, I'm going to do it. So there was these things that were happening, and there was momentum. And I knew, I had that aha moment. I have purpose. I can make this pain into my purpose. So this gift came wrapped in a very ugly package, but it was quite a gift. And so as I started moving up, my eyes are coming above water, I gained meaning, I gained purpose. I wrote the book. Confusion started lifting. And so here's what I realized. If my apple cart had not been turned over, smashed to bits, and put on fire, then I would not have had a period of spiritual growth, because that and expansion. And I think probably that was the most important thing out of this whole life transition, is that my relationship with Christ was just solid after this, and it wasn't that way before. So I was a better Christian after this. So that came along. I discovered purpose, like I said, and now I am the guide that I did not have when I was going through divorce. I help other people go through this extremely difficult transition. And so I also would not have an extraordinary life. I ended up marrying a man of faith, and we have a wonderful life. I did not know that I could have a better life after divorce, and it has happened, and I want everyone that has been through that to know you do not have to stay stuck in this pain. So everyone deserves and has the ability to create an extraordinary life with God as their co-author, and we deserve to be the hero, not the victim, in our story. So what was intended to harm me, God intended it for good. And it seemed like, I'm not blaming my ex for harming me, but it really did seem like evil was after me in the beginning of this. But what came out of it was so good and so fruitful. So at the top, you see that little red dot that says FC. That stands for Faith Challenge. And this is a defining moment when we must decide to put weight on a new direction in life. And you have a sense of, for this I was born. So this is what one of my coaches said to me. You go out on a limb, but you hear the chainsaw behind you. So I'll tell you my faith challenge. I was writing this book, and I wanted it to appeal to everyone, right? So I was really struggling with, should I make this Christian or should I do mainstream? It was extremely Christian. I didn't know if I should edit it to make everyone feel good, right? Well, I decided to go out on a limb. I made it strictly, it's a very Christian book, and I am so glad I did that. And then it was published by a Christian publishing company. So I'm so glad that I listened, I did it, I made it a Christian book. So that was my faith challenge. So there are tools that can help us get through this, and we're going to go through that on the next slide. Many of you probably know of Viktor Frankl. He was a philosopher, psychiatrist, but he went through Auschwitz. So he was a Jew, and when he went to Auschwitz, he had a heavy coat. And in his coat, he had his manuscript. It was his life's work. Of course, the guard took the coat and took the manuscript. And so from that point on, while he was in the concentration camp, his whole purpose and meaning was to redo that book and rewrite this manuscript. So he said, while he was in this horrendous concentration camp, that what got him through was meaning. And you remember what I said before, if you do not have meaning, you distract yourself with pleasure, and you got to go for the bigger, better deal. And he said those that were in the concentration camp that did not have meaning died, unless they were killed earlier. So he said suffering, or rather despair, is suffering without meaning. So that's how we become desperate, is when our suffering does not have meaning. So this is how he suggests we get through or manage a life transition. So he says, create a project, a task, or a deed. This is all to create meaning. So that could be service work. That could be going to Tijuana, to the orphanage. That could be it could also be feeding the homeless, because what happens is when you do this, you realize that your life isn't that bad. It takes the focus off of you and all the pain, because pain, when you focus on it, is going to expand, and it puts it on you serving others. You can also do a project. I mean, you really could do something in the house where you organize a closet, but the thing is, the idea is you set a goal and you do it, and it fills that little confidence bucket. So he says, find a task, a project, or a deed. The second thing, create or have a community of people that love you. So as morbid as this sounds, know your six. The 6 people that would carry your casket, the pallbearers. Know your 6 and have them with you all the time. So that's the second thing. And the third thing is the most abstract and difficult one to come to terms with. It's adopt a positive or a redemptive attitude towards suffering. So that means, and I'll go to the next slide, that you understand that pain, there's purpose in pain, and it's not in vain, and God does not work that way. He doesn't just punish you. There's always meaning, but despair happens when suffering loses meaning. So suffering minus meaning equals despair. And I love what he says, is suffering ceases to be suffering the moment it finds meaning. So those are 3 things that he says that will get you through that difficult transition. So let me see if I covered everything. I know there was one quote that I had by Viktor Frankl that I wanted to share with you. Let's see, here it is. So let's see, I did not put it on here. Oh, here it is. Viktor Frankl said, life is never made unbearable by circumstances, but only by a lack of meaning and purpose. So look for the purpose in the pain. Look for the purpose in the period of darkness. Even though we resist it, we hate it, nobody wants to be there. You have to sink in, feel it, grieve it, and then you can move on. You cannot bypass it. You bypass it through distraction and pleasure. I see it all the time with my clients. Those that do not want to feel the pain go to wine, or they immediately jump into another relationship. It will only sidestep it for a little bit. The pain will come back. So here's what I want to propose to all of you. I am a life coach, so I don't just do divorce. And divorce coaching is the same thing as life coaching. It's just we drill down on divorce. So if any one of you is struggling and slogging through any kind of life transition, I want to offer you a free 30-minute consultation. And look at me like a thinking partner. We bounce ideas off, because here's the thing. We do not reach clarity alone. We need someone else to talk to in order to come to terms with whatever we're going through. So that's my offer to you. If anyone wants to take me up on it, I do have a sign-up sheet that I'll put out there. And now I would love to take any questions, because I gave you a lot of information. So here's the sign-up sheet you can pass around.
And also, I just want to say that we're bringing India on as one of our official